All right, so this video is going to be about rhythm, and it's going to break down some number crunching, but also just a different way of thinking about rhythm. Basically, the point I'm trying to get across is that at the end of the day, we're only dealing with time, content, and information, and organization of that information and time. And there are many ways to go about it, and I think that some of the models that we use on a regular basis in, say, Western music, composition, that type of thing, they might sort of prevent us from seeing other options that are out there that just haven't sort of been hammered at us already. So, uh, with relative rhythm, we're talking about time in terms of time generally. And so that could be, beats per minute. That's how we talk about tempo, or cycles per second. That's how we talk about pitch, which isn't really rhythm, but it's time content. So I'm going to include it here. But uh, for for any sort of pitch, it doesn't make as much sense to talk about it this way. But for uh, tempos, for instance, where you're dealing with a pulse, say your pulse is 150 beats per minute. So this is kind of like a Beatrice Dillon sort of slow juke tempo. Basically, for a minute, you got 150 beats in there. So that tells you how long it is. Now, first of all, why are we talking about it in terms of a minute? There's no reason to, other than it's just convenient, but it makes it kind of weird to just be dealing with something that's 60 seconds, 60,000 milliseconds, and then this other set of numbers, which is how many things happen for that. We can really say how long intuitively a minute is. You can't just pull that out of your body. So having the one thing that you're referencing, like the pulse, is one thing, and then you can start saying for this pulse, this many beats. So maybe you have 3 in that, and whatever. So everything is this in terms of that. So when we go to the absolute version, basically this just means rendering some of those numbers. And this isn't that difficult, but a lot of people, I think, are uncomfortable, I feel like they don't feel empowered to fiddle around on a calculator. So I think this is a really helpful way to think of it. And I would credit Brian Shepard from USC, who's a composition and music theory and percussion teacher, who showed me how to do this type of stuff, which is, at the end of the day, you should be able to figure it out. But it became immediately useful to me because it makes you better at being able to organize or analyze organizations of time. So basically, if you have a piece that's, let's say that you're a movie composer and you're doing a scene that's 5 minutes and 32 seconds long, for some reason it has to be exactly that. You can work within that time parameter to start with, instead of feeling like you have to jam it out and then have something that hopes that it comes to an end at this point. So it allows for top-down considerations. This being said, the absolute stuff, when you get into the milliseconds, it doesn't really scale well, or it's not very, very dynamic. You can't translate it. So if you just simply change the tempo by a little bit, it would make everything, the wrong number. So that's why it's good to think in terms of relative sort of time content. But I think it's good to be able to do both. Good to be able to see sort of what is the smallest unit of time in this piece, and you can start to say, for instance, if I have a polyrhythm, you can figure out what tempo would be plausible to play it at, or whatever. So you can start answering these questions a little bit more assertively and quantifiably. So generally speaking, I think in terms of additive and multiplicative rhythm, which is generally seen as meter and phrasing, I would say. All our divisive rhythm is generally in terms of what I'll call a rhythmic octave or triplets. So you might get a quarter note, an eighth note, 16th note, 32nd note, whatever. You might get on a synthesizer, you might have something that's marked, whatever T, 1/8T. And so that's essentially your rhythmic perfect fifth. And so I think those are useful for sort of letting us go uh, across different scales of time. But I think that it's important that we also consider divisive rhythm, which I feel like has created a complicated language problem in Western music that most people just don't want to deal with, and most people don't want to interpret. Uh, like if you're going to write music that's uber complicated in this divisive sense, you better make it sort of intuitive to some extent, like somebody like Elliot Carter would. But otherwise, a more organic version of this would be something like Carnatic music of South India or various like African musics, where it's very much about this large sort of macro pulse and then the divisions of that. So with the divisive thing, I'm saying like you have this amount of time, and you divide it into 7 equal segments or 5 equal segments, and so basically, as you'll quickly realize, the bigger numbers essentially mean smaller things, faster things. So like smaller but faster, bigger numbers. And if you do smaller denominators, then it will be a larger segment of time. And then you get these meters where it's like, you're saying, okay, I have this period and I divide it into 4. But I only do 3 of those 4 things, but now you have a new period. And so that's kind of like you're thinking multiplicatively or subtractively or additively. And I think that there's something interesting about the integrity of that period. And so if you divide it, you're essentially getting like an overtone series of rhythm. And if you multiply the period, it's totally different. Like if you divide the period by 7, it turns into these little small things. If you multiply it by 7, then you have a phrase now. It's not even the meter, it's a phrase. And so the in-between here is the meter. Like I said, you have like 3 of those 4 divisions. But most people don't realize that you can have any number in the denominator. A lot of people say you can't do that. And I think when they say that, they mean Finale or Sibelius can't do that. My program that renders my stuff can't do that. You can still do it on paper. You can do it if you expect somebody to be able to play it or if you have a use for it, but nobody does that because it's not a common thing in Western music. So with some of the rhythmic lattices I'm exploring with Eliminativist, this is what I'm getting into. And at the end of the day, a lot of the time I do have to sort of render it out into absolute tempo mappings just to make it something I can program into Ableton or whatever. But it is helpful to be able to render that. So if you're talking about tempo and you want to make it into a duration, basically you just say, okay, 125 beats per minute or whatever. A minute is 60 seconds or 60,000 milliseconds. Milliseconds are generally better here because they allow for more granularity. And then you divide that by the number of beats. So I don't know why we would go with a minute, but that's convenient enough. The thing that I'll also mention about divisive versus multiplicative is if you want to do divisive or divisive in terms of multiplication, essentially you have to go to decimals instead of like floating points instead of fractions. And so fractions have sort of an inherent like beauty to them because they're just using integers, while like I feel like if you do blah 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 on a calculator and then you get this long string, it's like it's essentially saying we cut off at some point. And so like when you do divisive in terms of multiplicative, then you start to get all these rounding errors and these inaccuracies, and it's on some sort of level maybe less pure, but like we're already talking about like esoteric time organization stuff, so I don't know, that's just something that I consider. So something else with the divisive is that your limiting factor with basically how how far up the rhythmic overtone series you can go is going to be a physical limitation. So you might be able to, in this space of time, fit 7 equal pulses, but by the time that you're up to like 53 pulses or something, it's going to be totally too difficult. And so you can get into where your threshold is, your unit threshold, if you will. So like you have your period and you divide it into segments, and you would have your units or subunits or whatever. And so the limiting factor here, like I said, is the physical. But if you are thinking more about how many times do I repeat this period, this full cycle itself, it becomes more of an attentional limitation. So, if you have this divided by 13, you have to worry about feeling that pulse and then getting the right tempo of sub-pulses in there. But if you do this times 13, you have to make sure that you don't zone off while you're counting up to 13, because you have to do 1, 2, and like by the time that you're at 3, you're like, I don't want to count anymore. So counting, while it's like, the simplest thing, is kind of cognitively expensive. It's attentionally expensive. And so I think that it's interesting to focus our embodied sense more on being able to divide than on being able to multiply. Because, like, if you're going to do something where it's like a 7-bar phrase, it'll hopefully be in terms of like some sort of melody that will anchor it. And so you can actually just sort of feel that and be embodied with the music instead of, like doing what they do in orchestra, which, I previously played low brass in an orchestra, and so much of what you do is sit there counting tacit time. And so it's like, if you have 17 measures, like, to count, like, you're not going to sit there and be like, I'm not doing anything. Bar 2, I'm still not doing anything. Bar 3. So the limit there is attentional instead of physical or sort of complexity oriented. You might have a polyrhythm that's complex feeling, but even that, like, polyrhythms aren't that hard. They're only as hard as they are fast. And so, if you stretch out any polyrhythm to a much longer macro scale, it will be easy, and that will be as easy as anything else, really. That's at that same sort of like rhythmic gradient, if you will. But like, if you can extend it into a whole song, if you extend your this over that over that over that polyrhythm into 10 minutes, and then it's going to be relatively easy. Except then it's a multiplicative thing, because you're doing the divisive, but at the scale of the multiplicative. So anyway, at a certain point, your polyrhythmic structures can become multiplicative, and that's a smarter way to approach it. I think that people try to think of it as like, I'm cramming all this stuff in here, and I'm going to try and fit it in there. And it's like, you can't just be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Like, you have to have this deep sort of fractal sense of pulse and subpulse, and you have to be able to think relatively. And that's not just counting, that's dividing a time unit, which is a specific physical thing. So it's engaging with the physical sort of oscillation of this in a deep way, which requires coordination and requires that you have something steady to follow, like a metronome. Because if anybody sits there and says, like, I do 13 against 17 or whatever, like, but according to what, who's keeping you honest? There's no metronome keeping you honest. So I don't know. I think that it's important to be able to divide and to be able to render these things as precise, absolute, discrete durations, because it tells you a lot about the content that you're dealing with. And so, again, at the end of the day, we're just organizing time and information and communicating that to people. So, however you want to do that is fine. But I think that it's important to also consider some slightly more quantified approaches that aren't just like, oh, I do this curly Q thing on a 5-line staff and put little dots here that mean this. And then you're already thinking in terms of Western conventions. So, I think that's good to have both. And I guess that's all I wanted to talk about. Thanks for listening. Bye.